Good morning, Lady Angiolini.
Good morning.
Will you take the oath?
I will.
You raise your right hand and say the words. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
The next person you see should be Miss Graham, Lady Angiolini.
Thank you very
Miss
much, my Lord.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You are Lady Angiolini,
I am.
and I'd like to go through some of your background, but may I say at the outset, as you're remote, occasionally we do have issues with the technology. And if there is at any point you have difficulty hearing me, please maybe raise your hand or gesture in some way, and we will try and rectify the matter immediately.
Thank you.
Now, some years ago, you started your career as a Scottish lawyer in the Procurator Fiscal Service, and I understand you began as a Procurator Fiscal in Airdrie. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
And you thereafter moved to Grampian, Highland and Islands, again with the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, and ultimately became Solicitor General and then Lord Advocate between 2006 and 2011.
Yes.
You practiced at the Scottish Bar for a period after leaving your office as Lord Advocate, and then became principal at one of the colleges at Oxford University.
Yes.
And I understand that's where you are today. You're at Oxford University.
Yes.
Now, in 2012, you moved to Oxford, and as I understand it, your current role is now as Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University.
That's one of my hats, yes,
Right.
there in the university.
Thank you. And then in 2022, you were appointed by Queen Elizabeth II as a Lady of the Order of the Thistle.
Yes.
And in June of last year, you were appointed to the office of Lord Clerk Register by King Charles III.
Yes, that's right.
And for some, they may know you because you were actually in attendance at the King's coronation.
Yes.
And in fact, you are the first woman to have ever held that role of Lord Clerk Register since its creation in the 13th century.
Yes, that's right.
You're here today to assist the inquiry because you have, over the past few years, prepared a number of reports and conducted reviews. And I would like to go through those with you in turn to see what assistance they may be able to help the chair with. But first of all, am I right in saying that you would like to say a few words before we begin?
Yes.
And you have sought the permission of the chair to do so. And if you can take it from me that he has granted that permission.
Thank you. It's very brief, but I would just like to express my profound condolences to Sheikh Abayu's family and friends over his tragic death.
Thank you very much. For your information, Lady Angiolini, the members of the family are present in the hearing room in Edinburgh today. Let's begin, first of all, with your report from 2017. For those in the room, the reference is SBPI 00496. And this is a report called the Report of the Independent Review of Deaths and Serious Incidents in Police Custody by, as you were then, the Right Honourable Dame Angiolini, and it's dated January 2017. Do Do you see that on the screen? Or you have a hard copy, I believe, in front of you.
I have a hard copy.
Right.
For some reason, the screen is very small, so I'm just going to see if I can do something to make it bigger. I'm trying not to make it all disappear, but no, that's not done it.
You may find it easier to simply use the hard copy.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
There was then a 2020 report in relation to complaints in Police Scotland, and for those in the room, there was a preliminary report in June 2019, which is SBPI 00499. Do you also have that?
Yes.
And
I don't have the preliminary report with me, but I do have the.
do you have the final report?
Yes,
November 2020.
Yeah, I've
And
got
that is SBPI 00501. And that was an independent review of complaints handling, investigations and misconduct issues in relation to policing. We can see that on the screen in this room, but you have a hard copy also.
Yes.
Right. And then the last report I'd like to refer you to, and the most recent, is from February of this year, and that was the first part of the Angiolini report.
Yes.
And we'll come on to that. Here we see it on the screen, and if we can move down the page, it's entitled the Angiolini Inquiry Part 1 Report. My understanding is that there will be a subsequent part which will be published at some point in the future.
Yes.
And for our purposes today, I believe there is a reason why it was called the Angiolini report. Would you like to share that with us?
Yes. The family didn't want this to be a memorial to their daughter Sarah Everard, because obviously that she represents in their experience she was a wonderful young woman, and the report this report, it was not to be a memorial to her, and likewise we didn't consider it appropriate to call it after Wayne Couzens, because I think that would just play to his somewhat warped ego, so it was named after me.
Thank you. Looking at these reports, and we will come on to them in turn, but are these reports essentially the product of your research, the product of evidence that you've gathered in over a number of years or months, your findings, reflections and conclusions in relation to these matters that you were asked to review?
Yes.
And have you endeavoured in preparing these reports to make them as accurate and truthful as you can make them?
Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to begin with the 2017 report, if I may. And this is the deaths and serious incidents in police custody.
Yes.
Now, this review looked at major issues around deaths and serious incidents in police custody, and we can see that in paragraph 2. Now, for those behind me, they will see in each report that each page is numbered at the bottom on the right-hand side. Because we have a copy on the screen, there is also a separate PDF page number. So the executive summary is on page 7 of the actual report. But it's also on, I think, PDF page 9. And it's paragraph 2 that sets out in the executive summary the background. Do you have that?
Yes.
Thank you.
We see here on the screen the executive summary that on the 23rd of July 2015, the then Home Secretary, the Right Honourable Theresa May MP, announced a major review into deaths and serious incidents in police custody. And the review has looked at the major issues surrounding deaths and serious incidents in police custody. And can you tell us a little about why this review was instructed and announced by Theresa May?
Theresa May, when she had her initial discussion with me, and why she wanted this looked at was that she was very concerned as Home Secretary about the number of deaths in police custody, and also of young black men dying in police custody as well. There were a number there. She had met the families of these men, and it was very concerned about it to the extent that she wanted a full and thorough investigation into the circumstances, and asked me if I would be willing to carry that out.
And we see that this was announced on the 23rd of July 2015. When did you actually start working on the review? Was it that year or was it later than that?
I think it was as soon as I'd obviously put together a team and I make arrangements, for the giving of evidence, etc. So that it would have not been, and then carry out research before we actually got going. We had to look at what was available, what research was available, and any information that was of use before we actually started considering what the evidence would be. So there was a sort of what might look like a fallow period in preparation for it. But I can't remember the date now when we actually got going, but I think it was fairly brisk.
So sometime in 2015?
I would think so, yes. Yeah.
We're obviously interested primarily in events that took place in May of 2015. Would it be fair to say that you started work on your report within a short period of the announcement being made?
Yes.
Thank you. And that was July 2015. Could we look, please, at page 22 of the report? So this, as I understand it, will be PDF page 24. And I'm interested in paragraph 1.11, the terms of reference.
Yes. Yes.
And it said the review has three principal aims: to examine the procedures and processes surrounding deaths and serious incidents in police custody, including the lead up to such incidents, the immediate aftermath, through to the conclusion of official investigations. It should consider the extent to which ethnicity is a factor in such incidents. The review should include a particular focus on family involvement and their support experience at all stages. And then to examine and identify the reasons and obstacles as to why the current investigation system has fallen short of many families' needs and expectations, with particular reference to the importance of accountability of those involved in sustained learning following such incidents. And finally, to identify areas for improvement and develop recommendations seeking to ensure appropriate, humane institutional treatment when such incidents, particularly deaths in or following detention in police custody, occur. Recommendations should consider the safety and welfare of all those in the police custody environment, including detainees and others. The aim should be to enhance the safety of the police custody setting for all. And those terms of reference really essentially encapsulate the aim and what you were tasked to do by Theresa May.
Yes.
And we note that in the terms of reference, there's no specific jurisdiction that is given to you, but my understanding is that largely the recommendations were focused towards institutions in England and Wales.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
And I wonder if you could give us your thoughts. Obviously, you are a Scottish lawyer. You've been a former prosecutor. you've been the head of the criminal justice system in Scotland in your role as Lord Advocate, and you are the author of this report. And I'm interested in your thoughts on whether you think this report does contain relevant and useful information that may assist the chair in considering the issues that are part of the terms of reference of this inquiry.
Well, I would hope so very much. I think it's quite central to the circumstances here, which in this tragic death mirror similar circumstances which are referred to in this, again, particularly regarding the use of prone restraint and the dangers of that, and the associated behaviours of police officers in the context of these particular situations. So I think probably a direct relevance to it.
And also you do make a number of comments which we'll come on to regarding families and their treatment, and
Yes.
that presumably is non-jurisdictional in the sense that families can be treated in these ways regardless of where they live in the country.
Yes, exactly.
Could we look at the section on legal framework, which is page 25 of the report and page 27 on the PDF? And I'm interested in paragraph 1.25.
Yes.
And do we see that, in fact, the legal framework mentions the European Convention on Human Rights,
Yes.
and also mentions the Human Rights Act 1998, which covers the UK, not just
Yes.
England and Wales.
That's right.
And you've made specific reference and you have specific regard to rights under Article 2 of the Convention, which we've heard some evidence about in this inquiry.
Yes.
And is it correct to say, Lady Angiolini, that in that regard, in relation to the Convention on Human Rights and Article 2 and the Human Rights Act, that those are applicable UK-wide and not simply in England and Wales?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Can we move on, please, to look at page 26? And this will be PDF 28, and I'm interested in paragraph 1.32. And this
Yes, got that.
notes trends in deaths in police custody and suicides following police custody. And this is where, at paragraph 1.32, you mention the IPCC statistics. And are they from England and Wales?
Yes.
And there were 17 and 14 deaths in or following police custody in England and Wales in the years 2014-15 and 2015-16 respectively.
Yes.
And those are years from which you sought data as part of the basis for your report. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. And can we move on, please, to page 28? And this would be 30 on the PDF. I'm interested in your summary at paragraph 1.4.
Yes.
You
Yes,
see,
got that.
every death in police custody is a tragedy, but it would be misleading to conclude that every such death can be avoided. Sometimes, despite the best efforts of everybody involved, police will die no matter where they happen to be at the time of death. 1.41. However, where there are similar failings that are repeated over many years and the same patterns reveal themselves time and again, it is evident that much more can be done to prevent these deaths from occurring. And was that something that you were bearing in mind when you started to gather in all the evidence, that you could see patterns revealing themselves.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
And I think you said of the 17 deaths, later in the report, I won't go to that, but of the 17 deaths which took place in the year 2014-2015, I think you said 16 of them also involved elements of intoxication in the part of the deceased.
Yes, that's right.
So that in itself was a common theme that you noticed emerging from the statistics.
Yes.
Thank you. Could we move on to PDF page? Sorry, I've got to that. Page 32. Well, actually, we'll just stop the report there. We see that Chapter 2 deals with the restraint.
Yes.
And actually, there are a number of chapters that you deal within your report which are highlighted and which really cover topics that you've said may assist the chair when he comes to consider matters further. And would this
Yes.
be one of them, Chapter 2 on restraint?
Yes, I'd hope so.
And if we could look at page 37, please. And again, this is part of Chapter 2. If we can move down the page to paragraph 2.30, this is length of prone restraint. And I think you mentioned a moment ago that you thought prone restraint may also be something of direct relevance when the chair comes to consider his views.
Yes.
And then page 39. Sorry, page 38. You've also covered the topic of excited delirium and acute behavioural disturbance.
Yes.
You deal with the issue of struggle and restraint on page 40.
Yes.
And then at page 49, page 47, PDF page 49, you end each chapter within this report with a highlighted section called recommendations. And is
Yes.
this a distillation of your findings and conclusions in relation to each chapter?
Yes.
Now, you've said in the recommendation on this page, page 47, police practice must recognise that all restraint can cause death. Recognition must be given to the wider dangers posed by restraining someone in a heightened physical and mental state, where the system can become rapidly and fatally overloaded. Position is not always the determining feature, as great a danger can arise from the struggle against restraint as the restraint itself. And that's just the first of a number of recommendations that you've given there. But I wonder if you could tell us what your thoughts were in relation to restraint and the issues and themes that arose out of your consideration of that topic.
It was obvious, from the evidence in relation to the number of deaths that we looked at and the reports from coroners elsewhere that any form of restraint, as soon as you engage in that, the physicality of that, where people are sometimes may be suffering from a mental health disorder, or they may be intoxicated, or they may have drugs, whatever. Immediately there is a vulnerable situation. They have, and so the deaths, many of these deaths related to prone restraint, which in itself is just incredibly dangerous. And it's not just about the length of the restraint. As soon as someone is in a prone position, even if you don't have police officers either kneeling or pressing down on you in any way. The fact that you're actually lying on a hard surface means that your rib cage is against that hard surface, and there is an inability for you to extend and contract your rib cage against that surface. Immediately, you're in a position of real vulnerability and peril. If you then apply any pressure of any description to that, then there is a real risk of death. So it's essentially a very dangerous process, and that's what I was trying to alert the police to here, that the adrenaline of a chase or whatever takes place has to be put to the side in order that, and training has to be aimed at much more effective ways of calming people down, which is de-escalation, calming techniques, discussion. So not physically interfering with someone until or unless it's absolutely necessary in the interests of their life, if they were in a cliff edge or whatever, or there were other circumstances which made it impossible, then this type of restraint is something which should have alarm bells all over, basically.
Did you have a view at this time about the levels of awareness and recognition within the police in England and Wales about the level of seriousness of restraint per se? You describe it as peril.
No, I don't think they were. And again, if you look at, if you watch television dramas, if you watch any of these programs which are reality programs about police, they're always chasing someone and someone is pulled to the ground, very often in a tackle, whatever. But what police officers aren't aware is that as soon as they're in that position, then they need to, if they are lying down, prone, then they need to be in a different position altogether. Or if they're unconscious, you need to get them into the recovery position, obviously. But it didn't. I don't think police officers were as aware. I don't think the public were as aware. I certainly wasn't before I started doing this, just how dangerous this was. So it's coming into this inquiry that where I spoke to the physicians and understood the physiology of it, that suddenly I realised just how dangerous this was.
Thank you. And you've mentioned the importance of de-escalation. And we've heard some evidence about de-escalation and how that can be attempted prior to any use of force, such as restraint. Again, did you feel there was a recognition of the need and the importance of attempting de-escalation amongst police?
I didn't think so at that time. I think and I understand that it has changed since, although I haven't carried out an inquiry to follow up now what's the situation now. But I think there is a better understanding of basic psychology. If someone is in a state of alarm, if someone is agitated through alcohol or whatever, that calming, soothing techniques from a distance, so the person doesn't feel jeopardised, if it's safe, to try to soothe someone, to try and calm them down using basic psychology is much more effective than people steaming into a situation where they put their own lives at risk as well, because they don't know what they're going into by engaging in that. And I think that policing now more than ever has taken that on board and are now engaging much more in trying to improve communication skills, listening skills, methods of trying to soothe people who are in an agitated or distressed state.
And you use the phrase much more effective. Did you form an impression as to the effectiveness then of de-escalation techniques if they were attempted?
Yes, I think, I'm not sure if we refer to them, but we spoke to a number, I spoke to a number of groups of police officers in the course of it, and as well as speaking to experts from other states. And of course, it's different because it's different in some circumstances. You look at the states, it's difficult to compare. We're not comparing light with light because they have guns. So in a sense, the guns are maybe displayed, etc., and that it doesn't have the same effect of calming someone down, but it may engage someone's attention. in those circumstances. So I'm not for a minute advocating that we should have police officers with guns, and I think that would be a disaster to policing here, because I do think policing by consent is what we're proud of it in this country, and I do think it works, but it does require good skills of communication, and not all of that comes when you're 17 and you've been recruited into the police, where you've got a lot to learn at that age. But we've just had a recruitment of police officers in England and Wales of 10,000 new police officers, and many of them are 16, 17, 18. So there's a lot of maturity that has to take place to understand the psychology of distress and other people's anger, and ways of de-escalating that.
Thank you. Now, I think in the report you go on to actually deal with a number of matters that you've mentioned, intoxication and mental health. And I think intoxication you deal with in Chapter 3. And you make some comments about the training on intoxication. We've heard some evidence about intoxication. What were your views about the training required? Because for many witnesses, I think there's a sense they understand intoxication. Officers who are in a response team at the weekend will often come across examples of intoxication. What were your views about training being given to officers at that time?
I have to say, I can't remember what I said about that at this stage. If there's a paragraph where I refer to it.
There's a paragraph on training in intoxication at page 59, 3.36.
Yes.
And then at your recommendation section at page 61, you say comprehensive and standardised mandatory police training is required across forces.
Yes. I think.
And that's on intoxication. That's in the intoxication chapter.
Yeah. I think what was clear from this was that a number of the police officers, they only learn to deal with intoxication through experience of going out there and dealing with it. Of course, intoxication it manifests itself physically in so many different ways. Some people become very pleasant, in certain stages of intoxication. Others become morose. Others become agitated with alcohol as well, because alcohol it affects people in different ways. But one of the aspects about it is that someone who's significantly intoxicated is actually in a state of frailty, physical vulnerability as a result of that, particularly again affecting breathing and again aggravating the situation of prone restraint further. If someone has either drugs or alcohol in their system, then it's again something which police officers, I don't think were at that time, it wasn't particularly evident that they were being given very explicit training at the beginning of their career, rather than having to acquire that knowledge, after maybe 20 years of being in the police service.
Remaining on page 59, the training on intoxication section, we notice in the latter half of the bullet points mentioned at 3.36, you describe insufficient training and awareness by officers of the dangers of intoxication, a failure to recognise, 3.36, there it is, failure to recognise alcohol withdrawal symptom can be life-threatening, failure to recognise decreased levels of consciousness and dangers associated with deterioration in consciousness, and failure to recognise the risk of positional or postural asphyxia, where reduced consciousness may obstruct the airway, and the danger of obstruction of the airway by tongue or vomit. And we've heard some evidence here in connection with the need for officers to recognise that things may be a medical emergency, even if it simply is intoxication through drink or drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And was this a theme that you noticed, a sort of failure to be aware or recognise those things and the need for training?
I think police officers at the time were sort of fairly sort of nauseated that a lot of their job was dealing with drunk people. But you look at city centres at night, nightclubs, young people coming out, some of them in really dangerous stages of intoxication, sometimes also mixed with drugs as well. And therefore, them falling asleep, and if they sit down and fall asleep and fall over, etc. The dangers of that in terms of their life, apart from their vulnerability to other things which might happen. I don't think, I still think that some of the attitudes that I saw at the time were that they were just viewed as a pest. Having said that, other officers were, and if you ever visited an accident emergency department on a Friday evening or Saturday evening in particular, you would find a significant number of, sorry, my speaker's just come out, a significant number of police officers escorting patients into the A&E, and again, because they did recognise that the individuals were in dangerous states of intoxication and or had incurred some injury or physical injury as a result of where they found them. So I think that they acquire that through experience, but coming in, it's not something which I think is appreciated by. I still think significant proportion of the population don't realise just how dangerous severe intoxication can be in terms of the possibilities of inducing death.
Thank you. And then if we can move on to chapter 4 of your report, we see at page 63 that you deal with mental health.
Yes.
And the introduction to this chapter says the issue of mental ill health manifests itself time and again within the police custody context. Frequently, police officers find themselves as the first point of emergency contact for those suffering from mental ill health. The first instinct of most members of the public witnessing such an episode is usually to call the police to deal with the individual because of the disturbed or disorderly nature of their behaviour. Even families may call the police rather than an ambulance, where they consider their loved one's behaviour may result in injury or danger and is beyond their ability to cope. And certain characteristics commonly feature in cases of death involving mental ill health in the police custody context. And these include the ability of officers to recognise and interpret symptoms of mental ill health rather than attributing disturbed behaviour to drunkenness or drug abuse. I'm interested in your reference here to certain characteristics commonly feature. Was this something that you recognised in this chapter?
Yes.
And what common features in relation to deaths in custody or deaths following police contact did you observe?
Well, there were a range of deaths which I had looked at in England in custody, and certainly I think that the combination of alcohol and mental ill health very often mask the extent of the mental illness and could be attributed, if it's not particularly experienced officers, although the bar officers in police stations are supposed to be experienced, either sergeants or police constables who can recognise the dangers. I think I see in another report, I don't think it's in this particular report, that really when someone is in a state of severe intoxication, they shouldn't be going to a police cell. It really is a hospital. The difficulty is our hospitals, the A&E departments, are not designed to cope with the concomitant behaviours of people who are in those conditions, who may be loud, intoxicated and frighten other patients who are in there and feel very vulnerable because of the presence of someone who's highly intoxicated. And I did suggest that they needed to look at the design of A&E departments where intoxication was a feature and behavioural issues as well, that they might want to have soothing places where these people can be until they're seen by a physician. And if you combine also that with mental health problems, then again, sitting in an A&E for sometimes 2 hours with other patients around is not helpful to either the patient or to the other patients who are present at that stage.
And if we can turn to page 79 of your report, which is the recommendations section. And again, there are a number here, but do we see that you've recommended commitment and responsibility at leadership level is needed across police forces to ensure prioritisation of the issue of mental health and to bring about sustained change? That police recruitment and training should incorporate the different personal skills and experiences needed to fulfil duties relating to the needs of highly vulnerable groups, including empathy, communication skills, and the ability to employ de-escalation techniques. And did you consider that de-escalation techniques were particularly useful and helpful in a situation where the officers were dealing with someone with mental health issues?
Absolutely, and it keeps everybody safe. I mean, it's in the interest of the officers to be able to communicate in this way and to be able to display empathy, to calm and to soothe the situation, as opposed to physical encounters which bring danger for everyone. And a good example of that in operation is in New Zealand, where the New Zealand police force are trained very much on the basis of communication. They're very well respected within the population for their use of basic psychology and not engaging in the physicality, which is when the adrenaline is high or you're frightened or nervous or there's excitement, that there's a temptation to resort to in the context of arrests or restraint. And therefore, I think that there's undoubtedly a lot that we can learn from looking at other examples where different skills. And I think that's why when I hear that there's a lot of young people being recruited into the police, it makes me worried, because at the age of 16, 17, I would not like to be dealing with a 53-year-old person who is very drunk, etc., not having maybe the experience or skills or knowledge of mental health at that stage, because you don't have the experience of life as much at that point. Whereas again in New Zealand, police force recruit people from an older age group, again where those types of techniques of communication and soothing come more naturally because they've been acquired through the passage of time. And
was it your view that an increase or an enhanced use and training in de-escalation and communication techniques would be a way to avoid the use of force?
Yes.
And if officers avoid using force in the first place, was it your view that people would be safer?
Everyone would be safer, including the police officers. But particularly those who they arrest, because it is, an arrest is in any other context. An assault, you're laying hands on people, in those stages. So that event happening to anyone is a jolt or an unpleasant situation for them, and they're so that however they react relates to the physicality of it, and therefore the less of that there is, the more opportunity. It takes more time, a bit more patience, from the police view. They think, I'm not a social worker, I can't sit around here for 10, 15 minutes talking to this guy. Got the other problems. We've got to just get on with it. But that's at a high premium, and it comes at a premium of the dangers it creates for everyone.
And when you say a high premium and the danger it creates, is that in the case of a restraint, the risk of death?
Yes, absolutely.
And we see at the end of the bullet point we were just looking at, you say this should be embedded in the police appraisal process with assessment made on the correct use of force, and in particular where officers have been able to avoid the use of force. So again, yes. Is this a recommendation about trying to avoid the use of force?
Yes, it's about how you have role models, in the police who are looked up to because of their ability to deal in this way, well with members of the public, and actually championing that as a competence in policing, which is seen as being very desirable in terms of progression and your ability to police well. Whereas there's still, if you go to police colleges, again, the physical aspects of it are necessary, but again, the extent to which the psychological aspects are emphasised and taught and learned from older colleagues, I don't know if it's changed since I've done these reports. I hope it has, but and I think it would be interesting to see whether or not that has changed in policing today.
And that would be using the skills and championing the skills of officers of any gender or age or length of service who had particularly good communication skills.
Yes, absolutely.
And then do we see that you also recommend there should be consistent national police policy and guidance encompassing current learning and best operational practice, reflecting the need for a drastically improved policing approach to those in mental health need?
Yes.
And if we can move on now, please, to ethnicity, which is chapter 5, which begins at page 83.
Yes, I have it.
Now, when we looked at the terms of reference a short time ago, the word ethnicity was the term that was used within the terms of reference that you were given. And
Yes.
the review required you to consider the extent to which ethnicity was a factor in deaths in custody and serious incidents involving the police. And
Yes.
you have this chapter 5 entitled ethnicity. Now,
Yes.
this inquiry's terms of reference require the chair to consider matters relating to the race of Mr. Bio or his perceived race. We heard evidence last week from a Professor Meir that the words race and ethnicity may be used interchangeably. And from my reading of your report, Lady Angiolini, it would appear that that is the approach you may have taken in this report. But when the chair is actually reading through the terms of your report, would it be permissible and acceptable to you that he could treat those words as interchangeable? Or was there some sort of precise definition that you used in relation to ethnicity that may be distinct in any way?
No, they obviously they do have slightly different meanings, but I think I use them interchangeably, whether or not that was correct or not. But understood that you know we talk about race, but the reality is we are all one race. You know, the human race, we're all identical in terms of our our makeup. So there is only one race. But there are then regional, continental differences in terms of the physical and behavioural differences from one from another, and customs, etc. The ethnicity is, I suppose, most people think that it has a higher emphasis on social and cultural characteristics of people, including religion, beliefs, etc., or customs, food, etc. So I think. So I read the experts' evidence regarding this, but I think that one of my concerns regarding nomenclature and what we call people here is that there was a time at which we were quite fraught about what should be said, and people can be very insecure in these circumstances. Fundamentally, you can look at all of the definitions and the right structures, but what has to be there is compassion and love, and that sounds a bit a queasy word to use in the context of a report, but it is about compassion and respect and love for each other, and I think that's all of that is much more important than having a technical term, which sometimes it can change from one decade to another, according to whatever is coming out of academia as well. So I think that's why, when I look at this chapter as well, that it was really important to have a look at the terms. But when I look back at it now and I see it, I use it interchangeably.
Well, that's very helpful, thank you. We've certainly heard evidence from Professor Meir that they can be used interchangeably, but as he has agreed with you, as I understand it, that there are some subtle distinctions between the words. And we are aware the definition of race in the 2010 Act includes ethnicity.
Yes.
I'd like to go through some of this chapter with you, if I may. Could we begin with paragraph 5.1? The 1999 Macpherson report into the death of Stephen Lawrence was a watershed moment in the history of the police and race relations. Its author, Sir Ian Macpherson, included in the report an extract of a submission by Dr. Robin Oakley on the nature of the dynamics in operation in the policing of ethnic minority communities, a relationship which has been a fruitful source of tension and misunderstanding over many years. And you've given a quotation here. For the police service, however, there is an additional dimension which arises from the nature of the policing role. Police work, unlike most other professional activities, has the capacity to bring officers into contact with a skewed cross-section of society, with the well-recognised potential for producing negative stereotypes of particular groups. Such stereotypes become the common currency of the police occupational culture. If the predominantly white staff of the police organisation have their experience of visible minorities largely restricted to interactions with such groups, then negative racial stereotypes will tend to develop accordingly. I'm interested in your thoughts about this comment regarding police and their engagement with members of society.
And I think now we are, I think we're probably more cosmopolitan. People are travelling now even more abroad to many countries. Even since then, there's a much greater movement of people abroad and into different, ethnicities, and are feeling a bit more comfortable about that. But I do think that if basically the only representatives of a particular community that you deal with are those who are the ones that are getting into trouble, then that will skew your view. Because if you don't have friends from this area, if you're not going out to eat, if you're not meeting, and therefore you can talk about training, but it's also really important that during the course of the life that and I think that was one of the great things we did. When I was Solicitor General, I had the role of leading on diversity at that stage, and I went out round various mosques and Sikh temples and other religious centres, and also meeting communities, and got invited to a number of different weddings, make friends with these people who are still very good friends. But through that process, which I hadn't had in my experience, because Scotland didn't have a particularly high minority community compared to London and England and Wales, which is much more cosmopolitan. It was a fantastic experience, and you are seeing that the whole rounded nature of that community, and I think that's really an important part for police as well, is that their only exposure is not to those who they're investigating for crimes, but to the wider communities as well, because I think that makes a tremendous difference to the way people see each other.
And did you see the value of that engagement with the community and members of the Black or ethnic minority communities? Do you see the value of that in policing and the work they do?
Oh, absolutely. It's really important. It's really important that that's done. It helps break down barriers, and I think that there's not enough emphasis on it. And of course, the Chief Constable say, well, times are very hard, and a lot of people think that this is a sort of fluffy side of policing. It's not. It's absolutely critical to the success in engaging with communities.
Thank you. Could we move on to paragraph 5.7, page 85 of your report?
Yes.
You've noted here, institutional racism identified in the Macpherson report still appears to be an issue within the police service. This was alluded to by Theresa May on becoming Prime Minister when she said, if you're black, you're treated more harshly by the criminal justice system than if you're white. And was that the position, as you understood it, in 2017 when you prepared your report?
Yes, in England and Wales, I'd say again, the reality of Scotland going back to that time was, again, you saw very, very few members of ethnic communities coming into the courts as accused. Later on, towards the end, there were more coming in, but certainly it was very rare to see them in as anything other than witnesses.
And then 5.8, inevitably any death involving a black and ethnic minority victim who died following the use of force has the capacity to provoke community disquiet, leading to a lack of public confidence and trust in the justice system. This can be exacerbated if people are not seen to be held to account or if the misconduct process is opaque. There is a wider social and political context in which such deaths have occurred, often involving misinformation in the media about the deceased and their family, and the fact that despite inquest verdicts of unlawful or excessive force, the authorities rarely appear to be held to account. There's a number of points you make here in this paragraph. The disquiet, first of all, leading to a lack of public confidence and trust. Was that a theme that you saw emerging from your researches in this area?
What this brought back is that very often, if there had been a death, the police would be very quick to go to the press regarding it, and so the account immediately fed into the psyche of the public an account which was detrimental to the deceased in these cases, and those were appalling circumstances, and it also was reflected in the way in which the next of kin were dealt with in these cases, where the normal treatment of, if you had a murder or whatever, the normal treatment families would be given was not being given to the families of those who died in custody or in the course of restraint, and so I think undoubtedly there was a skewed view of the individual who was a deceased out at the very beginning, and I think I commented on it, maybe in this report, that that we should not be putting anything out regarding these matters at that stage. It wasn't appropriate. I'm not sure whether it's in this report or another. But
we will come on to issues regarding the media, yes.
Yeah.
And you talk there about, despite inquest verdicts of unlawful or excessive force, the authorities rarely appear to be held to account. And was that a theme that emerged?
Yeah, you would have the decision at the end of the inquest, and then very little coverage of it, very often, again in the press, and again, no systematic dismissals, etc. regarding these. There was certainly very much more defensive. Of course, police as employers have a duty to support and look after the welfare of their staff, but again, as the current Commissioner of Police in London has said, he wants the bad uns out. And he said he's no interest in keeping people, and so he takes a completely different view of this from what I think sometimes in the past was a bit more defensive.
And we've heard some evidence about defensiveness and concerns that in relation to conduct issues, that the police are conducting those or failing to conduct conduct proceedings. And there may, in some quarters, be a perception of defensiveness. Was that something that you saw in your researches down south?
Yes, and if you look at the outcome for most of these deaths, I mean, there were several of them that we looked at, and it didn't seem incredibly proactive thereafter about the lessons learned, etc. Again, the one thing I do want to say though is, we're looking at this from the sense of a textbook. This book is talking about it. I think, again, in fairness to police officers, I don't think very often it's easy for us to begin to put ourselves in their shoes and their perception as to what's happening. The only time that's ever happened that I've got close to it was because of body-worn cameras, which I think are a great development, and I think they're significant in terms of probably saving lives on the part of police officers and those in the arrest. But the one I saw was police officers who were raiding a flat, and if you read the report about it, it all sounded fairly brutal. But then the body-worn cameras were then, and the witness was spectacularly unimpressive in the way he gave his evidence, but then his body-worn video was shown of him going along this wall towards this house, and as he gets to the door opens slightly and a gun comes out literally about 2 feet from where he is at that stage. So it was incredible when you actually see the impact of that. But I think that generally speaking, the post-act examination by the police as to what happened, how we can avoid this in the future, wasn't at that time, and I can't speak about what's happening now, obviously, at this stage, as brisk and as objective and thorough as it should have been.
Thank you. Now, I think as part of this chapter, and I don't intend to go through this with you in detail, you have referred to a number of inquests and other deaths which you've made mention of, such as in 5.9 you mentioned restraint-related deaths following police contact of Roger Sylvester and Sean Rigg, and they highlight issues that you've looked at as part of this chapter of your report. I won't ask you to go through those in detail. We've heard some evidence of these, and the Chair can read this in due course. Could I turn, please, to paragraph 5.18, which is on page 87?
Yes.
You've talked here about stereotypical assumptions. The stereotyping of young black men as dangerous, violent and volatile, there we are, is a long-standing trope that is ingrained in the minds of many in our society. People with mental health needs also face the stereotype of the mentally ill as mad, bad and dangerous. There is therefore a particular concern with what Inquest describes as double discrimination experienced by black people with mental health issues. Now, we've heard evidence last week from Professor Meir about something called intersectionality, where a person is not simply black, but may also be female or have another protected characteristic, maybe black, maybe disabled. You mention here black people with mental health issues. Would this be an example of that intersectionality we've been hearing of, where the impact of those protected characteristics is enhanced because two are meeting?
Yes.
And you also mention here Inquest, which is in block capitals. We've heard of an organisation called Inquest down south, and we hope to hear from one of the directors, Deborah Coles,
Yes.
as part of this hearing. I understand you're familiar with Deborah Coles. Did she
Yes.
provide some assistance to you as part of this report?
She did, yes, and she's very experienced in these areas as well. So she is an expert in this area, I would suggest to you, and there will be many other deaths since I worked with her, which she will have also continued to accumulate information on.
Thank you. Could we look at paragraph 5.21? There is also concern that assumptions made about someone may lead to the denial of medical care. So these assumptions, these stereotypical assumptions, was it your view that that can have consequences, and one of those could be the denial of medical care? You say experienced
Yes.
officers may believe they know when someone is faking an illness, but such assumptions can prove fatal, and you refer to the death of Christopher Alder.
Yes, that's right. I think that's a very good illustration of that particular circumstances, because as it described, the officers laughed and joked while he was dying on the floor in the custody suite, and they reported that he was faking and died after being left unconscious face down on the floor for 11 minutes.
So am I right in thinking you considered the circumstances of that case of the
Yes.
death of Christopher Alder,
Yes,
and the views that he was faking to deny him medical care at a point
Yes.
he clearly needed that medical care?
yes, yes. And as it says at the bottom, the death rattles in his breath were also clearly heard on the video as well. So it was a real tragedy.
Thank you. And I think if we could look at your end section, page 93, where you talk about the recommendations. Page 93, which will be 95 of the PDF, there we are. And you talk about the IPCC. Who are the IPCC? Is that the equivalent of PERC in Scotland?
Yes, exactly. That's
Thank
it.
you.
I mean, I'm trying to think what the acronym stands for. Now I should know, but
As long as I know that they're the equivalent, the English equivalent
Yes.
of PERC.
yeah,
They should ensure that race and discrimination issues are considered as an integral part of its work. They should be monitored and fed into internal learning and the IPCC's watchdog role. IPCC investigators should consider if discriminatory attitudes have played a part in restraint-related deaths in all cases where restraint, ethnicity and mental health play a part. And that would be in line with the IPCC discrimination guidelines. A systematic approach should be adopted across the organisation, and they should address discrimination issues robustly within misconduct recommendations, including where discrimination is not overt but can be inferred from the evidence in that specific case. I'm interested in your views in relation to this, that as I understand these recommendations, you take the view that race and discrimination issues should be integral to the work of what in Scotland would be the PERC. And
yes,
they should be considering if discriminatory attitudes have played a part in restraint-related deaths. Would it be your view that where race or ethnicity is a factor, that the PERC, as it is in Scotland, should absolutely be considering discriminatory attitudes as part of their investigation?
yes, they should.
And you also talk here about them addressing discrimination issues robustly within misconduct recommendations. We've heard some evidence about the conduct regulations that apply in Scotland and have applied since 2014. And I'm interested in your use of the word robustly here. Could you explain some of your views about how you feel, how you viewed conduct or misconduct matters should be dealt with in a situation where there has been a death in custody, and in this particular case of a black man?
Well, I'm not sure it's in this report or another report. I looked at the way in which the IPCC were investigating these cases, and in many respects, at that point, they were not really equipped to deal with death situations. Most of what they were getting was, complaints about police officers in different scenarios. But when it came to the death situation, so for instance, they didn't have a 24-hour call out so that if there was a death, they were going to the scene of the crime, that's not the crime I'm talking about, the death. They're not there very often, and they're not what you could describe as a blue light organisation, and therefore, so you would have the police at the scene, no one from this particular organisation looking at and ensuring that the locus, as it's called, of the death is being supervised, that there's no interference with the evidence, etc. So it was a very desk-bound perspective of what they did. I think that's changed now. I very much hope it's changed because I've not been back to look to see whether or not my recommendations were taken up. But they do need to have that independent aspect. And I talk about elsewhere that the officers similarly who are involved in the matter should be separated, and that they should be treated as witnesses would be. We wouldn't put witnesses together in a room in a huddle so that they can discussing their evidence. You would normally separate them and take their statements where it's feasible to do so in that manner, and that wasn't happening with police officers in these deaths either. So there wasn't, I don't think, the briskness of investigation in some of these cases that you would see ordinarily in some other form of sudden unexpected death.
And I think, in fact, you do deal with issues relating to misconduct in some detail, I think on page 170. We won't need to go to that at the moment, but for the benefit of the chair in due course, I think you do deal with police misconduct in chapter 13 of this report.
Yes.
And
yes.
You quote, there's a very strong perception that police sit above the law and a different set of rules apply to them. Is that what you're saying about there's a perception that civilians are treated differently from the police?
Yes. Yes.
And in addition to that, you also mentioned conferral there for a moment. I think you specifically deal with that at page 153 of your report. Again, I won't put this on the screen. Sorry, there's somebody. I'm not sure if you can hear the noise of a drill outside. No, I can't
but
hear.
If you can hear interference, let me know, and I'll go out and make sure it stops.
Thank you. I'd like to touch on something else that you do mention in your report about evidence gathering. And this will take us away from the chapter on ethnicity for a moment. But if we could look at paragraph 1.10, which deals with ingathering of evidence.
Yes.
Now, to summarise how evidence was gathered, as I understand your report, you carried out meetings with experts and focus groups. In fact, we don't really need to have that on the screen, actually. I'll simply summarise it. You met with experts and focus groups, with police groups, community groups, and NGOs. You carried out a public consultation. You gathered in responses from that. And you spoke to inquest and provided a report on family listening days with families of the deceased, and a reference group was established to study literature and evidence internationally of deaths in police custody.
Yes.
Could you tell the Chair a little more about how you gathered in evidence in relation to deaths in custody?
Well, I think that paragraph sort of summarises it. There was a combination of individual, of next of kin from some of these deaths who I would see individually, and others where we brought together groups of police, a group of police officers to have a discussion regarding practices. So it would be more of a focus group regarding it, and. But again, there were other cases where it would be individual witnesses that we would see as well. And it was very helpful because Deborah Coles had very, very good contacts with policing and around policing, so she knew her way around that. So that was very helpful to do that. So there was a mixture of individual witness accounts, group meetings to discuss some of the issues and problems as well. And it's something which I do, it's not something that tends to take place in a statutory inquiry, but when I was asked about, for instance, the current inquiry I'm doing, I asked for it to be non-statutory because, again, it's very much more flexible and allows you to obtain evidence in private, which helps in the particular circumstances where you're talking about police corruption, so you don't have the audience present while that's happening. And I think it does enhance frankness, so that we deployed that in the context of this particular report and obtained some very frank accounts.
And I think if we look at the annexes of your report, Annex A deals with the meetings, page 249. Yes. Annex B deals with 253, the public consultation and the bodies you spoke to and approached to look for and got responses from.
Yes.
And Annex C is the inquest report of the family listening days. That's and right. There's some very detailed summaries of comments, I think you put in quotations from members of families who've been through yes. situations where a member of the family died in police custody. And were many of these deaths in relation to black men?
At that time, yes.
At that time, yes.
Yes. Not all of them were. There were also young men with mental health problems as well, and the one dreadful one where he was handcuffed in such a way in the back of the van that he asphyxiated because of the positional asphyxiation in the back of the van, the police van. Again, so there were a number of other families. It was a mix, but there were a significant number which were from families of young black men.
Thank you. And we were looking at the chapter on ethnicity, chapter 5, and I think we'd looked at some of the recommendations. I'd like to move on to the fourth bullet point. So this is on page 93.
Yes.
And it says national policing bodies and police forces should implement mandatory training and refresher training on the nature of discrimination, including on race issues, which aims to confront discriminatory assumptions and stereotypes. Policing bodies should consult with bereaved families on how such training can break down barriers and promote change. And if I can stop there for a moment, you were recommending an mandatory training and refresher training on the nature
yes.
of discrimination. So not simply
yes.
training for new recruits.
No.
But was that refresher training designed to deal with officers who perhaps have many years of experience.
Yes.
We've heard evidence that for a number of officers, they received training at the beginning of their career, but had not at that time in 2015 received further training in equality, diversity issues. Was this something that you recognised as an issue?
Yes, because so much changes in our understanding and knowledge, and I mean, this wasn't isolated, because in the Procurator Fiscal Service, we sort of, when I went there, we would go to some training courses, but we sort of learned on the job from older fiscals, and therefore they're influencing your thought patterns as well. And so when I was Solicitor General, I set up a college for the training of prosecutors in Glasgow, where, again, it was important that not just to train people at the beginning of their career, but throughout their career, so they continue to acquire more skills and understanding of current practices and thinking in a variety of areas. And I think that's part of the problem, is that those who are out there may be people who haven't had training in these particular areas for some years.
And you recommend, well, part of the recommendation there is that there should be consultation with bereaved families on how training can break down barriers. I'm interested in that comment, that bereaved families have a role to play in determining the training or the type of training that officers receive. Could you tell us more about that, please?
Well, there were a group of families that I came across during the course of this, who had lost their loved ones, and they felt it was very interesting. They wanted to help policing because they wanted to ensure that no other lives were lost, and so their position wasn't antagonistic. It was about trying to get better understanding, and they were willing to put themselves forward to help and to assist police training in these cases. And I think that was tremendously powerful when I went along to see an example of that. And again, you could record these. You don't have to have them, obviously, for every training session. Some of it could be recorded, but I think the impact of that is very, very impressive.
We've heard some evidence from officers who have had training along the lines of hearing about lived experience from Black colleagues or others, and they've described that in evidence as powerful and something that they remember. Did you take the view that that type of training could have more impact and could be recollected better by officers than perhaps training done online or in a classroom with a presentation?
I think it's a combination of these, but I do think that it's what we know, that visual impact is much more effective in terms of what we recognise than what we hear. And therefore, your concentration span, if you're just hearing, a lecture or something, but actually engaging with someone who is telling you about these things, it would be, and I think also just how impressive they are and how much they want to help. The overwhelming sense I got from these families, they just wanted to prevent further deaths of this nature. They wanted young police officers to understand the absolutely cataclysmic impact it has on families and on them, because the police officers who are involved in these deaths very often are very ill for the rest of their lives as a result of these. So it's not, and it can develop mental illness and tremendous stress for the rest of their lives. So it's in everyone's interest to get this right. And I think that was something which these families were very willing to try to assist. And likewise, in the current inquiry, Sarah Everard's parents, again, know they cannot get their daughter back, but what's absolutely at the forefront of their mind is preventing other young women, or young boys for that matter, being killed in public or murdered in public. And they do so much because that helps them as a family. So I think that, again, that I hope that the police will, if families want to be involved in that, try ways of involving them, because I think that would help with the training.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious of the time now, Lady Angiolini. Could you give me a moment, please? Would that be inappropriate?
Yes. Well, we'll stop for a 20-minute break, and members of the inquiry team will liaise with you, Lady Angiolini.
Thank you very much.
Ms Graham.
Thank you. We were looking at Chapter 5 on ethnicity, Lady Angiolini, and we'd been looking at your recommendations in this chapter, which were on page 93 of the report, which will be 95 of the PDF. And we looked at the first 4 of those, and I'd like to move on to the next recommendations. These, if I could sum up, talk about data collection and statistics. Now, and we don't need to look at this particular chapter, but Chapter 2 of your report raises the topic of data collection and the need for accurate data collection. And I think you make a recommendation in Chapter 2 at 2.75 that the police should record the range of variables, and you recommend that that be done in a consistent and systematic way. And then we see in relation to ethnicity in this chapter, if we move on to the next bullet point, which I think is the 5th, the IPCC should monitor the correlation between ethnicity and restraint-related deaths, including in healthcare settings where the police were involved. Statistics should be published breaking down restraint-related deaths by ethnicity. And then you go on to say, the National Programme for Police Data Collection on the use of force must include ethnicity and mental health, as well as other factors, in all force data so as to provide a standardised national picture. You then say national data collection on the use of force should be analysed by the Home Office to draw out patterns and devise national strategies to address discrimination issues. And the outcome of that, both the data collection and the analysis should be made public. And you then say the IPCC should monitor ethnicity and deaths in custody against ethnicity and arrests by reference to all arrests, including non-notifiable offences. I'm interested in your thoughts on this topic of data collection and gathering in data specifically regarding ethnicity that you've recommended here, and also the comment and recommendation regarding analysis of that data. Why is it so important to have police officers and police services gathering in data and analysing it, primarily in relation to ethnicity?
Well, unlike the Scottish Police Force, which is one national force now, there are 43 different police forces in England and Wales, and therefore the gathering of information, the College of Policing in England and Wales gathers a lot of statistics, etc. But again, that has to come from the grassroots of each of these areas, from the police stations, etc. It has to be fed back. And I think it's really important because it just wasn't that statistical analysis across these forces. Because again, you want to look at if there are hot spots, where it's occurring, or where there's a pattern over years, in order that it can be investigated. So if you look at the number of deaths from hanging in cells over the years, there was a miraculous decrease, and that was just incredible. And all it was that they removed ligature points from the cells, and some cells had more ligature points where someone could hang a rope or whatever, a belt, than others. So again, it's about the learning and cohesiveness of the information in order that we can continue to monitor it properly. I suppose it's a pretty dull aspect of the report, but it's nonetheless absolutely critical for the future.
Thank you. So the data collection, although it may not to some appear as perhaps dramatic as other parts of your report, this data collection allows hotspots to be identified, patterns to be spotted, and allows analysis to take place. And then from what you're saying,
that analysis can then lead into learning, which can result in fewer people dying.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this, what starts with data collection, and in the right way and in a systematic way, can actually end up with fewer deaths.
Yes.
And before I leave chapter 5, I would like to ask a couple of things. Can we look please back at 5.10, chapter 5.10? And we touched on this briefly at the outset. It related to the death of Sean Rigg.
Yes.
And if we look at 5.12, you not only talk about the Sean Rigg, the death, you then talk about the review that was carried out after the IPCC investigation. We've heard some evidence that the IPCC investigation, although it was supposed to look at race, did not. And that was,
That's right.
that was reflected and drawn out by the subsequent review. And
That's right.
if we look at paragraph 5.12, a number of people who gave evidence to this review, that's the subsequent review, considered that race and ethnicity should automatically be considered as a factor in any investigation where these characteristics are present unless proven otherwise. The concern that the issue of race is not always considered in investigations is a long-standing issue that was raised in the Macpherson report. Sir Ian queried whether officers failed to fully accept racism and race relations as a central feature of the investigation. And you say investigators need to start with an open mind and go where the evidence takes them. But there is a need to think ahead of the evidence in order to give full consideration to the potential for discriminatory treatment and practices from the outset in every investigation. And I think you go into this in more detail, but you say at one point in your report there may be a perception that investigators are reluctant to look at race. And that to some extent will tie in with the recommendation that we looked at earlier at the end of this chapter. I was interested in this idea that there was perhaps some reluctance to look at race, and that's why, such as in the Sean Rigg investigation carried out by the IPCC, that although they should have looked at race, they simply didn't. Is this a theme that you have noticed emerging from your review?
I don't recollect that being a particular issue that came over from the cases that we looked at, but I think that many investigators and still police officers this day are nervous about the issue of race, and again, some of that comes from the fact that they may have had lives where they have few friends or interactions with people from different races, and that they or different ethnicities, and that they and therefore that they are concerned to insecure in their training and how to approach it more than anything. And so it's the elephant in the room. We're not. It's there, but we'll treat this as we would, unless there's something really specific that comes into the evidence which suggests that it was an issue, so something someone shouting in the course of their evidence. It's I'm just trying to paraphrase a sort of breach of the peace type thing. Black bastard or whatever they shout. That would then be the entree into looking at that, when in fact it should be in their mind from the very beginning.
We've heard that there may be circumstances where there are not those overt examples of racist language being shouted during an incident or such like.
Yes.
And we may have heard evidence that it's vital that investigators look at underlying examples of evidence that may amount or give rise to inferences of potential
Yes.
racism. Would you agree with that?
Yes, yes.
And did you see a route whereby that nervousness, perhaps on the part of investigators, or reluctance, could be corrected, could be resolved, so that they feel less nervous?
Well, I think that's where it's not just about training, but actually getting out there into the communities where there are higher Black and ethnic minority communities, and feeling comfortable, having colleagues who are. I remember one a Black police officer gave evidence to me that he said that he found it very difficult, because he said that, you know, he'd be out in the street in his uniform, and he would receive abuse from members of the public about being a Black police officer. So he was the target of because of that. And then he said he would take his uniform off and go home, and he would be the target of abuse for being Black in other circumstances, just in his private life as well. But he said that he never felt that he could discuss it with his colleagues, because he would be perceived as playing the race card. And so he was very isolated in that. And I think that that we have an obligation to explore and to learn more about it, to make sure that we are, you know, not just simply looking at textbooks, but we're actually getting out there and actually begin to understand some of the issues and challenges that our colleagues may be facing, but also members of the public may be facing in their lives because of their ethnicity.
So not just training, whether reading books or texts, the engagement with training where it's lived experience being shared, or perhaps demonstrations of some sort, but also, again, engaging with the community.
And there are lots of cultural feasts and celebrations as well, and some members of these communities are delighted to invite you. You know, if you had a police officer who wanted to find out more about, for instance, the Sikh community, you know, they can go along to their services, they can go along to a wedding, and meet people, and, you know, and have these opportunities to, you know, get to know people from these communities. So it's not easy to do that on a concerted basis if you've got 100 new people coming in, but it is something which, if you're going to police the community, you're policing the whole community, so that you must therefore feel comfortable dealing with people who have mental illness, or who are disabled, or who are visitors from the country, from other countries. You've got to have the ability to communicate and empathise with a full range of the community, and that's something which, that's why I was talking about the New Zealand police force, where people are a bit more mature, a bit more confident about talking to people, having a chit chat with people. Whereas if you're young coming in, and still predominantly male as well, there are still not enough women in policing. Those skills are something which they learn eventually, but how do you accelerate that and make sure that they're fit to be out in the streets?
And so potentially learning available from experiences from international police forces, as well as those within the UK.
Yes. Yeah.
And the comments you made about training, particularly regarding ethnicity, would these equally apply in other spheres, such as in the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, and for
Yes.
precognosers and advocate deputies, and those working within a wider sense of the field of justice?
Yeah. I think it applies to every aspect of those who are involved in public life, that they are serving the whole community. And certainly, you know, when I look back to when I was a young deputy fiscal, there were very, very few. I can think of anyone when I started who was from an ethnic minority there must have been in other offices, but very, very few. But this is what, why it's unconscious bias. He didn't actually ask, he didn't challenge, because that was it, so we had an assumption. Sometimes we used to be told, well, a lot of, for instance, in Glasgow, there was a significant Pakistani population, and we knew a lot, and we had friends and neighbours who were Pakistani. And they used to say that they weren't that keen for their children to go into law. They didn't really have a very high regard for lawyers, but they wanted them to be accountants and doctors. That was seen, and therefore that could steer them away. But nonetheless, nobody went out there proactively to actually see what we could do to try and make our organisations much more representative of our communities and enriching our communities as a result, and our ability to deal with witnesses and victims from those areas as well. So I don't think that was confined to the justice system. I think if you looked at universities, if you looked at any other organisation, the judiciary, everywhere, there was a complacency. And I think that has changed. Sadly, it's changed because of these tragedies, which it has brought us to a screeching halt about the absence or the apathetic approach there was to this, because everybody just, I'm sure that anyone who applied would get in, but if the fact that people weren't applying or weren't coming in or weren't coming through universities into these areas just wasn't questioned.
And I think without the need to go to the report at the moment, I think you come back to this theme in your 2020 report, specifically regarding Police Scotland, to encourage diversity and unconscious bias training to be provided more widely, regularly and consistently in that regard across Police Scotland. And so you also relate the benefits of training also specifically to the police in your later report, if that's right.
Yes.
Can I move on, please, to Chapter 9? This is headed IPCC Investigations. And we see at 9.1 that on page 121, which will be 123 PDF.
921.
Yes. 121 is the page, and Chapter 9, paragraph 9.1. You'll see the Independent Police Complaints Commission, the IPCC, is referred to, and this chapter deals with them. And I think earlier you said that's the English equivalent of PERC in Scotland.
Yes.
And if we could look, please, at paragraph 9.22. Now, I appreciate that this relates to the position in England, but you do deal at paragraph 9.21 and 22 with the issue of independence. And we've heard that that is an issue that arises in connection with investigations under Article 2 of the Human Rights Convention. And in paragraph 9.22, you say, this issue is wider than close professional connections between the police and the IPCC. There is also a wider cultural and historic connection whereby ex-police IPCC investigators may bring cultural assumptions and sympathies with them. And we've heard some evidence about the position and independence in this inquiry. And we've heard that certainly in 2015, and indeed now, we've just received the up-to-date statistics that 62% of the investigators within PERC in Scotland at the moment have a connection, or a former connection, I should say, to policing. And we have explored the issue of independence and the independence of PERC with a number of witnesses. And I'm interested in your thoughts here regarding independence and the issues that arise. And in paragraph 9.22, you mention close professional connections are one aspect, but there is also a wider cultural and historic connection. I'm interested in your thoughts about this connection, seen through the prism of Article 2 and independence, and the difficulties that those connections and historic connections can give rise to.
Yes. Yeah, it was a concern. I'm not aware of what the change was there. I do recollect that the head of IPCC accepted it as an issue, but I think the problem that how they articulated was that they needed people with these skills, and it wasn't easily, so that you had to have some form of policing, particularly if you look at this, things like scenes of crime detection. If there was a death, you expect the IPCC to be there, but and I criticise them for the fact that very often they weren't, or they weren't there. They'd come up 2 or 3 days later, and they're not a blue light organisation, as they describe themselves. They haven't got, they didn't have at that time at least emergency provision to get there. I said, you need to have some to be effective in these cases. They need to have that facility, and they're all very much based in the west of Scotland. And I said you had to have a Scotland-wide resource, at least in regions, so that you had the ability to have people there. But in terms of the reliance on police, of course, it was the easy way, but it did, I think, cause me real concern at the time when I looked at about the not just perception, but the reality of their independence, and the likelihood that people knew people who they were investigating or knew of them, because it's quite a small country, and I would hope now that situation, after so many years, has now been addressed.
Well, we heard yesterday from the current commissioner that the current number of investigators with a former police connection is 62%.
62 is still very high.
Yeah, you've talked about the impact on public confidence, and I think at 9.23, you quote from someone from that spoke in the family listening days. See 9.23.
Yes,
there is a perception that the IPCC operate with the police to protect officers, that investigators tend to be made up of ex-officers who are working with ex-colleagues, and this leaves the process feeling one-sided or lacking true independence. And was that a concern that you heard from family members who've been involved in deaths in custody?
Yes, they did as well. I think the next paragraph mentions that. It gives an example of observing the police IPCC arriving and appearing quite chummy with the police, or chatting together, and again, and I think 924, I say the member of the family said the IPCC investigator wasn't real. He was an ex-policeman who was a wall. We couldn't talk to him. He was there to defend. It felt like he was protecting his job, protecting the Metropolitan Police. This is obviously in the English context. So again, that really undermines wholly any confidence that can be had in the process, if that is the makeup of the organisation. I hadn't appreciated that even now it's as high as 62%, which I think is worrying.
I wonder if we could look at your recommendations in relation to this chapter, page 137. And I think I'm particularly interested in the second bullet point. Ex-police officers should be phased out as lead investigators in the IPCC. To the extent that the IPCC still considers this expertise is required, ex-police staff should act as a consultancy and training source within, and more appropriately out with, the organisation. The IPCC should also look beyond England and Wales for expert consultants and secondees from other investigative organisations who are also expert in the investigative forensic skills required to investigate such serious cases. For example, from the Procurator Fiscal Service in Scotland and the Office of the Ombudsman for Police in Northern Ireland. A wider pool of expert resources can also be considered by looking beyond the immediate jurisdiction of the IPCC. And I'm wondering if you can expand on that recommendation and whether that remains your view.
Yeah, I think it's very important that they get a range of different experiences of investigatory approaches, so that they're not simply mimicking the police, because they have a different task, but they do require to acquire some of the investigative and forensic skills, which can, again, there'll be some experts from within the police who can provide these and the training, but not rely wholly on the police as the whole source of staffing, as well as the whole source of training. Again, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and even and ERA itself, the Republic of Ireland. I used to visit them, and the chiefs here, to learn about their policing issues, and they were very helpful and very willing to assist and to look at issues in different jurisdictions.
Thank you. And then moving on in the recommendations, you then also talk about written information about sources of specialist support, including information about inquest, should be given to every family at the very first contact with an IPCC representative, as well as alternative forms of information. IPCC staff should tell families immediately following the death of their loved one of the right to independent specialist legal advice. I'm interested in your views on the support that can be provided to families who find themselves in this situation. And you've mentioned there some recommendations. Again, was that something that you felt would assist families?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think there's some technical difficulty that the family are drawing attention to.
Oh, sorry, I didn't.
I'm not sure, my lord, whether or not you're having difficulty, but I have lost one of my earphones. It just pinged out my ear. It's on the other side of the room. So
Well,
I'm not sure
you
that...
can go and attend to that, Lady Angiolini,
Right.
while we try to resolve this issue. Yes, I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's possible to have the remote connection and the document up on the big screen at the same time. Am I right in thinking that?
Well, we could perhaps, it might make it easier if we put the recommendations back on and see if it will come onto the television. 137. Yeah. Could we put the
I think the technical
not you.
expert is here now. Thank you. Lady Angiolini, I think we're back on course again. I suspect that Ms Graham might have to repeat the question that she's just asked.
Thank you. I had been planning to move on to two of your other recommendations on page 137 of this report. And I was reading out the recommendation that written information about sources of specialist support should be given to every family at the first contact, and that IPCC staff should tell families immediately following the death of their loved one of their right to independent specialist legal advice. And I was interested in your thoughts, Lady Angiolini, in relation to whether this would support the families, but also assist in looking at things from the point of view of independence, whether you thought this would enhance independence and improve public confidence.
Absolutely. I think in terms of Article 2 of the European Convention, family is entitled to legal advice in these circumstances, but I'm not absolutely sure whether I'm not getting that recollection right. But that was my, I think is my recollection. But the availability of and specialist legal advice, so solicitors who are comfortable and understand police stations and the environment there is really important, so that the family have that support. And Inquest is mentioned. I was very impressed with Inquest as an organisation, and they had a number of excellent barristers and solicitors who provided pro bono support as well as acting and representing once funded for families, and who could come out to the police station and provide the family with representation in these circumstances and help communication with the family, who are, as you can imagine, in these circumstances, not in a condition to be able to communicate and take command of these matters. They're in a state of absolute shock and distress.
We do hope to hear further from Deborah Coles from Inquest later in the inquiry, and hope to hear from her in relation to support that can be provided to families. Then could we move down to the bottom of that page for the recommendations? The second last bullet point there. Your recommendation said the IPCC should urgently consider whether to adopt a formal time limit for the completion of Article 2 investigations, with the lead investigator obliged to set out in writing why any extension to this limit was required. We've heard evidence in this inquiry about the length of time that the investigation took and the duration of the period between the death of Mr. Bayo and the final PERC report finally being sent to Crown Office. And I was interested that you have highlighted there whether to adopt a formal time limit. Can you expand for us, please, on what your thoughts were in relation to that?
Yeah, well, I obviously, when I looked at some of the times in some of these investigations, and it struck me as being a great deal more leisurely than was required, and that the whole, given the distress to the family and the tragedy that there is, families can't move on. They're not going to move on with their lives in a dramatic way, but can't even begin to grieve properly until these processes are completed. So there is this urgent need to secure the evidence briskly. And you'll see I made recommendations also about that the IPCC weren't really resourced or designed in a way to have 24-hour cover. So that if something happens in the middle of the night, when a lot of deaths in custody do happen, they weren't about. So there was a need to change their skill set and their approach to this, and understand they were the investigators. But likewise, the time limit is important. We have in Scotland time limits for the prosecution of many cases, and while there's a capacity to ask for an extension in these cases, I think the courts were, at least in the past, I haven't been there recently, very vigilant to ensure that wasn't just because of a dilatory approach to the investigation, that there was absolutely a very good basis for that. And I think that it struck me that the manner of the investigations was somewhat leisurely compared to what I had seen in the justice system. And I think that's why I considered that it was really important to allow families to move on with their grieving and get beyond this. It was really important.
Sorry. And obviously you have experience of the timescales in Scotland, and you will have experience of, in fact, prosecuting murder trials and dealing with matters along those lines. In situations where there has been a death, perhaps a murder, culpable homicide, something along those lines, there are no issues about identification of the people who were involved in that matter. What sort of timescale would you anticipate a murder investigation, a culpable homicide investigation to reasonably take? I appreciate it will vary depending on the circumstances, but when you're talking about time limits, what sort of region were you considering would be reasonable?
So are you talking about the police investigation, or the Procurator Fiscal gets involved in that? You can very often
Yes.
attend at the scene of the crime that night or
Well,
day,
it could either be just the police or police and PERC, or it could be including the Crown investigation and the Crown precognition being prepared. But did you have any thoughts yourself about a sort of reasonable range of periods that could be?
Well, the 110 days is a limit, even for a murder case in Scotland, for where the accused is in custody, and it may have changed again. I'm not familiar as to whether or not it's changed recently. And 1 year, if the accused was on bail. So 1 year, if you look at it, it looks to me as if it would be the outside that you would be looking for the completion of these processes as well, which should be taking place with quite clear targets at the beginning of the inquiry. Sometimes they become more complex, and again, in criminal context, you can go to the court, revert to the court to ask the court's permission to extend the time limit, but you have to have a firm basis for that. And I think that part of the problem here was there wasn't any sense of urgency about this, and no time limits, which could really give them a discipline to ensure that things were done not speedily with the injury to quality, but done briskly and with a view to the fact that you have a family for whom life has stood still, and the need for that to happen briskly for everyone.
Thank you. And just for those members of the public who may be listening, that 1 year period would be where the accused was on bail, and
Yes.
that would be the period of time within which the trial would commence, subject to any applications to extend the period, either from
Yes.
the Crown or the accused. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Could we turn back to Annex C, please, which is on page 254? I said that I would come back to the issue of media engagement. And you'll see that Annex C is the report of the family listening days.
Yes.
And I wonder if we could look at page 271 of the PDF. And, page 271 of the report, and paragraph 1.8, which is under the considerations. There we are.
Mm.
And this talks about false narratives and victim blaming. So this is an aspect of as I understand it, the discussion that took place on one of these or both of these family listening days. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And you've highlighted here that families outlined 2 key ways the media had impacted on their experiences of the process. For some, the first they knew of their relative's death was via media outlets, including on Twitter. Mm-hmm. And others had complaints about the way the media was used by both the police and the IPCC immediately following a death. Families were unhappy that stories, often unchecked by them prior to release, ended up misinforming or muddying the waters. And this took the form of creating false narratives, thus helping erode any confidence in the veracity of the investigation and inquest process. Some families felt this was an intentional tactic, often starting at the point at which officers conferred, and you refer back to that, employed with the express purpose of deflecting blame or responsibility away from those involved with the death and shifting it onto the victims. Evidently, this tactic is not rare, as a number of families provided examples where information about the families or their relatives was used to create a false narrative, and according to families, often in collusion with the media. And then you give a number of quotations given, no doubt, at the family listening days from a variety of family members. Could you help us understand the significance of these issues to families who are dealing with a death in custody?
They were absolutely heartbroken about this situation, because they're trying to contend with just the horror of having lost their loved one, and then these distorted portrayals were appearing in the press the next day, when the only information that could have got out would have been from the police, and that's why you'll see that I make quite a great deal about police not conferring during these circumstances. But some police officers, even to this day, have contacts in the media. The media rely on the police for stories, particularly if there's a shortage of news, and it used to be the press would attend the court. You very rarely see press in courts now, but they rely on police to send out those stories to them, or to pass these. This is an informal and situation. This is not something which is condoned by their employers. But so I think the impact on families is from the very beginning. They have a skewed portrayal of their loved one, and therefore they have a sort of rebuttable presumption that the whole situation is going to be stacked against them when it comes to the circumstances of their loved one's death being investigated neutrally and independently.
And was there any evidence that you gathered in relation to these false narratives and victim blaming themes and patterns that ethnicity or race was an element to that? Yes,
yeah, I think there were cases, and I think Deborah Coles from Inquest will be able to tell you about the specific cases where she has experienced that as well.
Thank you. And then I think, just for completeness, you do specifically deal with issues in detail about family support in Chapter 15 of your report. That starts on page 193. And I think at paragraph 15.10 on page 196, you talk about the family's perception, 15.10, about perception about those who subsequently advise them that following the death, police forces have been quick to portray the deceased and their friends and relatives in a poor light in an effort to neutralise any public sympathy. And you've included there not just the families and the relatives, but friends also. Was that something that you noted when you were gathering in evidence about this?
Yes. Yes.
Did you have any examples that came to your attention that related not just to families or relatives or friends, but to legal representatives?
In the context of legal representatives
and a
providing
narrative
information
being portrayed in the media?
of legal representatives of the police?
Legal representatives of the families.
Yeah, certainly. I do think that we spoke to a number of those who represented, and they had real concerns about this. This was a real, that there was almost like they galvanized it into action to portray a negative account of this, and there would be an account from an unnamed police officer, who the media just so happened to have a link with, who would presumably be one of the officers involved in it or close to it. and this would then be provided. And that was from a very early stage, the media portrayal of the situation is bad, mad guy, or black, bad, mad guy, to complete the picture of police officers having to go in and deal with these very, very difficult cases.
And do we see in paragraph 1510 that you give a quotation there? They said information was given that the relative was a drug addict, but that's not true. She had mental health problems. There was an article in the press saying she was a drug addict, and the reporter said the information was from the IPCC. So did you have examples of not simply police officers possibly sharing stories with the press, but also the IPCC sharing stories or presenting a narrative to the press?
Well, that's obviously one of them. I can't remember if there were any other examples, but that's why, again, I was concerned about the percentage of former police officers who were investigators in the IPCC, and gave them specific targets in the Scottish context to reduce that reliance, because it wasn't appropriate, because they all knew each other. So you had, and so the notion of an independent investigation when they'd all been colleagues years before was almost farcical. And therefore that was, I was absolutely critical that this was a truly independent group. And if, these statements were being provided by the IPCC staff as well, that's again another warning sign about the lack of independence in that process. I'm sure. I hope you've in fact you've told me it's still 62% police officers, and I still think that's much higher than it should be.
And then to conclude, do we see that you have summarised your recommendations at chapter 18 of this report? And these are grouped thematically.
Yes.
And those themes include, on page 235, restraint, and you've listed the restraint specific recommendations, which can be found in detail during within the body of your report. And then they also deal with funding for families and the issue of family support at page 238.
Yes.
And these themes cover all the recommendations that are within the body of your report.
Yes.
And will be available for the chair to consider in due course.
Yes.
I'd like to move on now, please, to your 2020 report, please. And this, I'll look at the final report, and this is from November 2020, and it's SBPI 00501. So we have the reference, and that's come up on the screen here. And I understand you have a hard copy of that final report.
Yes.
And this is the independent review of complaints handling, investigations and misconduct issues in relation to policing. And am I right in saying this is the one that's specifically in connection with Police Scotland?
Yes.
Thank you. If you can just give me a moment. I'd like to ask you some questions about police culture, and I think paragraph 26 may be the right place, maybe not.
Yes, that's right.
Is it right? Okay. But I am interested in police culture, and we've heard some evidence about this topic, and we've heard the use of a phrase, canteen culture.
Yes.
We've heard evidence that police culture is not monolithic, and I think we heard that from former DCC designate Fiona Taylor. And you have referred in your report to the strong influence of what we've heard was called legacy forces, the 8 regional forces which existed prior to the 1st of April 2013 when Police Scotland came into existence. I wonder if you can help us. What was your impression about police culture when you came to preparing this report?
I'm influenced to some extent now because I'm looking at it through the lens of having looked at it in the Wayne Cousins case. I want to make sure I don't confuse what
Sorry, Lady Angiolini, I couldn't quite catch that. The sound went slightly there. Sorry.
Okay. I just want to make sure that I'm not merging what I have come across in the context of the Wayne Cousins investigation about culture and what I remember seeing at this time in Scotland. But one view, I think, was that the Strathclyde was very dominant when there was this merge, when they came together as one police force in the early days. And there was a slight sniffiness, if I can call it that, by former Strathclyde officers about the skills and the abilities of the other forces. I'm not sure whether or not that dissipated over the passage of time as promotions and better integration would take place when people moved about from one part of the country to the other. But I'm without reading this section again, I don't think I can remember specifically anything that I said other than about inclusion and diversity. But I don't think that at the beginning they felt comfortable suddenly being embraced in one national force. I think it took quite a while for it to settle.
All right, well, we'll maybe come back to that. Can I ask you to look at Chapter 9 of this final report?
130. Yes.
I've just realised the reason I'm having difficulty finding the right chapter is I'm looking at the preliminary report here and I haven't brought my final report. However, I do have the correct page references, but you'll have a slight advantage on me at the moment, which I can correct over lunchtime. I'm interested in Chapter 9, which I understand in your final report deals with inclusion, diversity and discrimination. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
And can you assist us by explaining to the Chair how you gathered in information and evidence in relation to the experiences of Black police officers in Police Scotland?
I was assisted by some of the organisations, the police organisations that represent officers from this background. Semper rings a bell.
Yes,
I'm not sure if that's
we hope
Semper.
to hear from the chair of Semper in Sandra Dillon Clark. And we hope to hear evidence from her in due course during the inquiry.
And there were other, I can see from 9/7 here, I met with a range of groups representing minority communities and evidence gathering meetings with BEMIS, which I'm not sure what that acronym is for, but it's umbrella body supporting development of ethnic minorities in the voluntary sector, Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, Scottish Women's Development Forum, and Scottish LGBTI Police Association, as well as Semper. But all of these groups were very helpful in actually identifying other people from who I was particularly interested in regarding the issue of ethnicity and the impact there. And I also asked the police if I could be put in contact with any officers from those communities as well, and they were helpful, and I was able to write directly to officers and invite them to come and see me. And a number did come and give evidence to me individually, as well as having a large focus group of officers as well, where they were really forthcoming and very very helpful.
Thank you. So you not only spoke or took evidence from individuals who had evidence to give in regard to issues of inclusion, diversity and discrimination, but also conducted a focus group. Can you tell us a little bit about the focus group and how evidence from the focus group was shared with you?
Well, I'd be present at the focus groups. I would go along to them, and we would have a facilitator who would, ask a particular question, and then we'd ask people, for their views or experiences of the particular issues we were looking at, and there'd be note takers who take notes of the issues which or the evidence that was being provided from these individuals, and it was very good because you would have different views, but people were very respectful of each other, and it was enormously helpful. And I've used them also in the current inquiry that I'm doing as well. I've just had 3 days of focus groups from different areas of policing, looking at not dissimilar issues from those who were looking at police culture, for instance. And we had, a full day of different focus groups each day of police officers and non-police officers and those supporting them to help give evidence. So it does give that informal setting also, I think, makes people confident to give evidence.
And how did you identify the individuals or the organisations which were chosen or selected to attend those focus groups?
From different sources. Some were from the police, some were from, so for instance, Semper were very helpful in being able to identify other charities and other organisations that they related to. And the Chief Constable, I have to say, was very helpful as well in identifying organisations that he thought could help give a sense. And I have to say that certainly at the time of this, the Chief Constable was incredibly supportive of the process.
And
it wasn't a defensiveness.
Sorry. And were there black officers involved with those focus groups, as well as giving individual evidence, who had actual experience, real lived experience of being officers for Police Scotland or previous legacy forces?
Yes, they were. And in fact, that police officer that I mentioned, who described his experience of, of the abuse he would get from being black and then as a black police officer, but then what he felt at the time was, and I'm still very marked by his evidence, is that he would come back to the station and people will ask, how are you getting on, etc. They would never tell them about it because he said he was always concerned about being seen to play the race card. And so, these were so additional pressures. Not only was it happening in terms of the abuse, but then the feeling that you had to actually not moan about it or seek support from your colleagues, which other officers would have done readily in such circumstances.
And was that evidence of that real experience with Police Scotland used as a foundation for the conclusions that you drew in your 2020 report? Yes.
The evidence which we got from these officers certainly describes there were recurring themes emerging from the experience of different groups and how individuals within the police service felt they were treated as well as how communities felt about the police. So they were all from individuals who we came across during the course of those. And some of them actually would do, if they were at a focus group and they had an awful lot to say, we would then take a statement from them afterwards and interview them afterwards.
And in terms of rank, were they from a variety of ranks throughout the police service, or was it concentrated in one area?
No, there were some who were in supervisory positions as well. It wasn't just police constables.
And was there also a range of length of service? So perhaps more junior officers, but also those with a lengthy service over a number of years?
Yes, there was a mix.
And in terms of learning from those focus groups and the individual witness statements, were those of use to you in terms of considering issues regarding discrimination?
Yes, and again, this marked feeling that some of them were hanging on in there, but contemplating leaving. And that was something which was marked as well. Because of the sort of the feeling of double discrimination that they would have from the public, but all policing the public, but also then not having the empathy or at least not feeling confident enough to seek empathy or support from your colleagues because of this apprehension that they were seen as I said earlier, as it was described to me, playing at the race card. In fact, I think it's in the chapter. I've just spotted it in this. It's at 9.5.
9.5, thank you. We can maybe come back to this after lunch. So although your report in terms of the 2020 report deals with complaint handling, investigations and misconduct, and it's not specifically or exclusively focusing on complaints of race, or racial discrimination, is it fair to say that that was something that was very much considered by you as part of this report?
Yes, yes.
And in doing so, the evidence that you gathered sought specific experiences from, would that include black officers as well as those from other ethnic minorities?
Yes.
Thank you. And I've just realised that I didn't actually explain at the outset the circumstances in which you had come to prepare this report. And I wonder if you could, just before lunch, maybe explain how it came around that you were asked to prepare this report. And I think you had been approached by one of the then cabinet secretaries in the Scottish Parliament, Mr. Matheson. That's
right. He was the Justice Minister. So I was asked, he approached me. He had, I think it's in the forward here, the Cabinet Secretary of Justice and the Lord Advocate, in fact. It was both of them. I'm trying to think who the Lord Advocate was at that point after me. It might be.
Would that have been James Wolfe? I think if we... Well, I think you do not have the preliminary report, but I have the advantage of having that in front of me. And it says, in June 2018, Michael Matheson, the then Cabinet Secretary for Justice, and the Lord Advocate James Wolfe invited you to conduct an independent review of complaints against the police in Scotland. And that was commenced in September 2018.
That's right.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. If I could be given a moment, Miss...
Yes, well, we'll stop for lunch and we'll sit again at 2 o'clock. And again, the team will liaise with you, Lady Angiolini.
Thank you very much, my lord.
There's a bit of a glitch there. That's the Angiolini report.